The apprentice training model has existed for hundreds of years and it continues to evolve. So this is the concept of a person being mentored on the job with training in a formal environment. Apprentices of old were given the worst and most dangerous jobs. And while this still happens in some form, we at Swinburne strive to train apprentices in not only keeping themselves safe, but building a long-term, career-long commitment to health and safety. So this means when they move into management roles, they can embed those processes and that skill and that passion for keeping people safe. So while our safety record in our workshops at Swinburne is pretty good, we can always do better, and we can certainly use technology to help achieve this goal. So this is where our concept came from. What if a workshop could actually communicate back to its human users about how to keep safe? How could we do this in a way that supported the existing OH&S framework, keeping in mind there's some legal requirements there? How could we make it fun? The project team aimed to improve these three outcomes. Number one, introduction of mixed reality content into traditional engineering programs without compromising the intent and the requirements of the training package. Goal number two was to increase the digital skills across the teaching team and the project management team. And goal three was to improve workplace safety. The engineering programs that will benefit from this program are some of the least theoretical and most practical of all courses offered at Swinburne. Students are routinely welding steel, cutting materials with plasma cutters, operating industrial standard guillotines, and using a range of hand and power tools to bend, drill, and grind materials. So it's potentially pretty dangerous. So in informing the scope, we got some input from our workplace health and safety advisor at Swinburne, who provided some specific comments about what she'd seen in terms of how safety is managed in these workshops. First thing is that PPE, or personal protective equipment, is often seen as a nice to have by the students rather than being enforced. And that's despite the teachers having a big focus on enforcing that. Sometimes the glasses come off or the gloves come off or whatever, and the safety doesn't happen. Another observation is that we often buy or install equipment that is not completely set up in the right way at the start, and that means workarounds have to be addressed. So we tried to weave that into the project outcome as well. Another specific requirement of the project, and this was a non-negotiable, is that we had to comply with Swinburne's internal processes and the Australian standards. So there's actually an Australian standard 1319 around the design of safety signs. So we had to meet that requirement. We couldn't change the colours or be overly creative there. It had to work. We also had to make sure that our standard operating procedures were used and not messed with in any way. So they remain part of the project. So the project literally became to augment what was already there, to add to what was there rather than to change things from the start. The pedagogy behind the solution design was influenced by several of the main educational models and theories. So the intent right from the outset was to gamify the experience and have some fun with it, but not to introduce technology for its own sake. The gamification approach allows latitude for students to develop their motor skills in using the equipment and their knowledge of logical safety considerations. So this learning becomes scaffolded rather than lineal. They can chip away at it, they can come in and they can come out. And it's consistent with Kolb's experiential learning theory, where students actively experiment to build experience, observe and reflect, and conceptualise the next steps. So this is not a one-off. This is students coming in, using the equipment regularly, and going through these steps to build their knowledge and skill overall. So starting with that active experimentation, not too crazy, but doing some experimentation, building that actual experience, reflecting on it, conceptualizing what that actually means, and then coming back and doing it again and repeating that process. Another important educational model that we referred to more as a health check tool along the way was to look at the SAMR model. Where we land on the SAMR model is very much around augmentation and enhancing the learning experience. We're not seeking to transform it. After all, we've got students that are using industry standard equipment. We don't want to simulate that. We want them to use industry standard equipment. What we do want to do though is to augment that experience to make it more interesting, more engaging, but not lose the core purpose of why they're with us, and that's to use the equipment and to build those skills. And of course, as is just good practice really, we considered constructive alignment. The advantage of training packages is that's already done for us. So our health and safety modules are structured at the start of a course, but they're also embedded along the way as just good practice. This helped make sure that workplace health and safety was provided along the way, and it was really a form of formative assessment, even though it's not assessed. So the big learning in this project was understanding how to design in augmented reality. We soon discovered there are some constraints and opportunities afforded with designing in AR. So there's specific learnings that we'd encourage you to take up as educators and basically to learn from our mistakes. There were close to 30 evolutions of our prototypes. So changes were based on technical issues, and there was a bunch of those, mostly files not opening, the experiences or the behaviours behind the characters not publishing as they should. The other main consideration that made us change a prototype was that the element or the component of the game needed to change because it was affecting the user experience. One important tool that we referred to was the universal design rules. So one of the first considerations was designing for students on the autism spectrum. So what we learnt from that is that the buttons in the game have a simple instruction. We then looked at designing for users of screen readers. Now, less of a cohort in this group, but we needed to make sure anyway that it was covered off. This means the game sequence is linear, so it does go backwards, but it is a linear game. It has a start, a middle and an end, and it means that it can be operated fully with one finger tap on any device. So in terms of accessibility, it's pretty good. A big consideration was designing for users with low vision or vision that's affected in some way. It was interesting because we had 2 students self-identify as being colourblind, so that's actually quite a high percentage in our group, and it was higher than the national average if you consider the percentage of students in the class. We ended up using a triadic and a tetradic colour scheme, or at least our best compromise of getting there. I'll show you the diagram here about what that actually means. Now this is really, really important in augmented reality because by nature you're imposing a colour scheme on a natural environment. So what goes on behind the colour scheme is just as important as what you're actually creating. So we actually needed to take into account the contrasts of the interior of the workshop, where there's a lot of dark colours and a little bit of white. So the colour scheme that we chose we're pretty happy with. Yes, there was some aesthetic and some subjective decisions in there, but we cross-checked it against a triadic and a tetradic colour scheme to make sure that we were on track. The final consideration was users with physical or motor disabilities. Again, tap control, really easily done with one finger tap. And we also designed for users who are deaf or hard of hearing. We deliberately added captions. And for students with dyslexia, we always had images to provide additional support with the text. And on top of all of that, we created a voiceover. It's deliberately sounding robotic, but we think that's quite fun as well. A big part of the testing for this particular tool was considering FOV or field of view constraints. So field of view is what you can see out of your eyes, and obviously that changes when you're looking at a device. So humans have a 180-degree field of view, field of vision, and most of the tools that we use have a lot less than that. So there's a huge range here, and as you get down to smaller devices, handheld devices, the field of view becomes extremely narrow. So we had to take that into account, and the way we addressed that was by having lots of testing about the size of characters and making sure that the majority of the shot could fit within the field of view at the correct distance back that we needed. Our next consideration was the prototype development. We used a rapid prototyping model. The beauty of building in augmented reality is that you're not building anything physical, so we didn't have to wait for manufacturing to happen, we just did it. So we had the concept, we refined it, we built it, we reviewed it. More often than not there were issues, and we just kept that cycle going. And as I said before, we had over 30 different versions of the prototype. Our initial concept though, I'd like to say, was created by our senior educator, Mel Jeffrey. Really simple, and she sketched it out on a piece of paper, and that became our brief. So as we developed the prototypes, we first started off being, I guess, serious, and the first cut of our prototype was fairly corporate in its look and feel. It had buttons, icons, it was a single colour scheme, and it was incredibly boring. We hated it. Well, I hated it. The initial intent was to tap on a standard operating procedure. That might happen in a future run, but we've taken that out at the moment because it just added an extra level of maintenance of data back on the website that we don't necessarily have the resourcing to do. This is what we landed on. So we've gone for a gamified aesthetic. The colour scheme is quite suitable for colour blindness. We think it's pretty good. It's simple, it's fun, and it's got a bit of a retro look and feel. I'll just take you through it now. Findings. It really was a learning experience for the whole team. Our number one finding, not surprisingly, was have a realistic scope. So despite what the Adobe Aero functionality is meant to be, our experience was quite different. We also made sure that we did respond to those limitations of the tools. So we went for a reliable model that would work time and time again, rather than something that had all the bells and whistles and would have its limitations. I will say that our pedagogical considerations were reasonably unchanged. So we used the models that I mentioned earlier as our guiding principles, I guess, and we constantly referred to that, and that kept us on track. So overall, it's a great experience. We're going to keep this going. We've got lots of ideas on stage 2 that we'll be doing outside of the Adobe grant project. It's been great. Thanks for watching.